Right.
Next question is from Joe Sunseed. Joe, you are unmuted.
Hey, so, well, I have a couple of questions, but it just requires you to confirm if this is an accurate description of your view of the biological race concept. Do you see a biological race as a geographically defined set of populations which, in the past, if not now, lived together and bred with each other more than they bred with outsiders? Someone told me that's a quote of yours. Do you see that as an accurate description of your view of race?
It's almost a perfect quote. Yes, but it is not a restrictive definition of race because the geographical aspect in your phrasing is probably slightly different from what I used when I said that. What I would point out is that a race is not necessarily geographic. Of course, human races happen to be geographical, but you could have had, and it could have happened in a certain percentage of cases in humanity, that the routes of migration are arranged such that you have races developing, but they are not on contingent geographical location that you can draw circles around. In fact, the Jews are the perfect example of that. Jews are a race, but they are spread throughout the world.
Okay, so it doesn't sound like you think that race is biologically real then. You think that it's contingent upon a myriad of factors, and namely, you think that it's historically contingent.
No,
That is, you think that there's only like a certain time interval in which we can talk about human populations, and we can call those races. Is that what you're saying?
no. So I'm not saying that it's not biological just because I'm not imposing the geographical component of that definition harshly. What I'm saying is that races are not geographical necessarily. Now, most of the races, we will be able to link them to a certain continent and a certain place of origin. But I'm pointing to the fact that because of human traveling, you can have other factors than geographic ones that can lead to the formation of races. And by the way, that's also true in animals. You can read speciation by who's the a very well known Coyne, Jerry
Jerry
Coyne.
Coyne.
Yeah, Jerry Coyne. In animals, you can have races that develop out of sexual preferences, arbitrary sexual preferences, and we can say that the races are sympatric. I believe that's the word we use in science. So yes, it doesn't have to be geographical, but that doesn't mean it's not biological, because the basis for the concept of race is the nuclearization, the kind of clustering of genes in groups of people that are more similar to each other than they are similar with other people outside the group. As soon as you have clustering, you have races.
I mean, why are you picking this cluster of traits as being the cluster of traits that we can use to identify biological race over any other cluster of traits? Humans have hundreds of thousands of traits. Why are you picking sometimes geographic distribution, sometimes just like genetic traits? I mean,
Well, I'm
what's
not
the principled
picking.
reason why this set of traits is the set of traits that's going to help us identify a biological race?
Well, first, the traditional say white, black, Asian. These traits were picked because you can see it without having any sort of testing. You can see it to the naked eye. That's why these phenotypical traits were used rather than others.
So you can
But
see how
personally,
tall
as a
someone is, though.
scientist,
But you can see how
just let
tall
me
someone
finish, and then
is. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. My bad. Go ahead.
so personally, as a scientist, I do not say we should use these categories. I say we should use them if we want to use them. We could use others. In fact, in my Mati Buddha video, I indicate you could divide humanity in 600 races and you could select various clusters that emerge. But the fact is, you're gonna, whatever other phenotypic trait that you use to define race, if it is a phenotypic trait that has indeed evolved separately in races, you're going to end up finding that your clusters that you develop with that other phenotypic trait ends up overlapping with the clusters of white, black, and Asian. That's what was found by geneticists when they started looking just at the genes without knowing anything about which genes makes you black or which gene makes your skin white. They just looked at genes and they said, yeah, it overlaps. Any cluster that we design, it ends up overlapping with the traditional conception of race, black, white, Asians.
Wait, so are you saying that we choose the traits that cohere with our folk concept of race, or these the big three traditional concept of races?
No, I'm saying that if you don't choose the trait, if you go into the genome and you select random genes, I'm telling you the computer will end up classifying these people as you would have if you just saw their faces and their skin color. So the computer can find that someone is black without having any clue that he's black, without having any clue that of how the genes work and how the genes make your skin become black. The computer will detect this just based on 20, 50, or 1,000 genes.
Well, it will actually make several different groups. Like when you use structure, like Rosenberg 2002 did, they identify K of 5, K of 6, K of 3, several different human population groups. So whatever traits that you pick out and you plug into the computer, it's going to make a different size group. It's going to make several different groups, or it's going to make the 600 groups that you're talking about. It just seems like eventually it's going to be up to whatever the researcher is interested in looking at. But that means that it's not biological, and at worst, what I'm hearing from you is just something that's completely arbitrary. Like,
Absolutely not.
why should we use your understanding of race to do science at all if it's just a complete mess like what you just described?
First, I did not stand for a particular. I think that you believe that I believe stuff about race that I never said, and I think you're attributing stuff to me that I've not said. As far as your interpretation of the Rosenberg 2002 paper, it is wrong. The K3, K4, K5, K6 of this paper is an arbitrary threshold, but you can set all of them. You can look at k equals 3. So that's the equivalent of telling the computer, all right, I'm giving you these human populations, divide that in 3 groups. And you can see that at k equals 3, there's already a division. You can see that people don't end up randomly being placed in Africa when they are in fact of Asian or white descent. And when you do k equals 4, well, you have more refined groups. And k equals 5, you have even more refinement. But these refinements are all in line with the traditional conception of race. There's none of them that truly violates our conception of race. They are just more precise or less precise look at the genetic data. And by the way, it's not arbitrary. Rosenberg and et al. 2002, it is not arbitrary. To the contrary, he gives all of the genetic data to the algorithm and he says, however you want to place it for me. And the algorithm just orders it in the way that happens to correspond with our traditional conception of race.
No, Rosenberg's research and his later research in 2013 isn't arbitrary at all. He had research aims, and so he used the structure program and other, like, I guess, methodologies to see if he can actually meet those research aims. I'm saying what you've been working with seems completely arbitrary because at one point you were fine with there being 600 races. So I'm just not sure which traits do you think are going to be those we should use to identify a race that would be at all scientific. Like you came in here saying you think that it's within the tenets of science to, try and do things that might be touchy to other people, like talk about race and everything. But you haven't even explained to us why it's useful to talk about race at all. Because so far you just said that you can have a race that's just coheres with the traditional concepts of race, which there are at least 17 of them. Or you can have 600 of them. And at one point you even say that Jews are a race. I don't see any foundation that you've offered in order to hold up all these other views that you've taken from from your view of human
Well,
variation. It just doesn't
you
match with
jump
what modern scientists say about human diversity.
Well, I don't care what modern scientists say. I care about the data that modern scientists bring. Because what they say is modulated by their desire to get funding from government agency that wouldn't fund racist research. And so I don't give a shit what modern scientists say. I care about what they know and the data that they bring. Now you jump from things that are completely across different dimensions here. Your first attack is that I didn't that you seem to believe that there is a contradiction between saying there can be 600 races or there can be 5 races. There's no contradiction, and this shows that you have a misunderstanding of embedded concepts. So embedded concepts, what could it be? Suppose the color yellow and pale yellow and dark yellow and orange and slightly more red orange and then red. Okay, all of these colors, you could classify them as yellow and red, or you could classify them in 255 categories, where each color differs, and you make the difference between pale yellow and dark yellow and average yellow. And so it's not because you can label a thing across multiple levels of precision that this thing does not exist. That's your first error. Now, your second error is that then you move into the question of usefulness. You say, I didn't defend the concept of the usefulness of race, but you didn't ask me about it. Now, when we talk about usefulness, we're talking about something very different from truth, because something can be true and useful, something can be true and useless, something can be untrue and useful. For example, self-deception in psychology, it's something that is untrue but useful. For example, I could deceive myself into thinking that I'm a charming man, and by deceiving myself that I'm charming and that I'm not fat, I could obtain a much more beautiful woman. Just out of this act of self-deception. So usefulness is independent of truth, but usefulness in the concept of race, it does have a use. People use race constantly, for example, in their sexual preference patterns. On dating website, it's one of the criteria
I'm
that's
interested in
essentially you can write, I
scientific
don't want any black, or I
importance.
don't want any Asian, or I just want Asians.
No, I'm not interested in that type of utility. I'm talking about whether or not it's something that's scientific. So, I mean, we can look at matronymial categorizations and use them in science. They're useful in that way. But, I don't see what's scientific about your concept of race at
Well,
all.
what's scientific is that when Rosenberg asked a computer, is this data random or is it clustered? The computer answers clustered. And so race is as useful as knowing what Rosenberg found, which is that genetics in humans are clustered. That's it.
I mean, that's not very, I mean, noting that humans have traits, and so we can group them based off of those traits isn't really helpful. We can group
It
humans
is.
into all people who are under 6 feet tall and all people who are above 6 feet tall. There, bam, I just did something that's on par with Rosenberg's research, according to you.
No, because you haven't proven that the height was genetically transmitted and that you had a grasp of the genetic factors that were transmitted, so it wouldn't qualify as a race. Now, if you were to find the
Wait, why
genes
not?
for
I'm sorry.
height,
Why doesn't it
well, you
qualify as
have
a race?
because it is not genetic. You have merely observed a
Height isn't
phenotypical pattern.
genetic?
Well, if that's what I was about to say. If you were then to find out that height is genetic and that when you go in Asia, people tend to be smaller, and then you go to America and they tend to be taller. If you were to find that, absolutely, you can define a race on height if you want. People just haven't done that because there are better science than that.
Okay, what's a better one that you appeal to then?
Skin color, for example, is much better. You will know much more if someone comes from Africa or his ancestors come from Africa if you look at their skin color rather than their height.
People from Melanesia have the exact skin color as people from Africa, so it's not useful in differentiating between geographic groups. I don't see why
Yeah, but
it seems like you've just picked skin color because it coheres with the already established folk concepts of race.
when I use skin color, I use this as a general term, including facial characteristics and all of these things that you can feel when you see the faces of different human beings. Joe, don't lie to me. If I show you a Malaysian and I show you a black African, tell me, are you going to see the difference?
Well, since you meant skin color secretly to mean 5 different traits, obviously I would have to think about, well, what traits are you identifying? The issue is that when you just said skin color, it seemed like it wasn't going to be helpful at all in making sense of the pattern of human diversity. The other
And what you're
issue
doing
here,
right now,
the
that's what
other,
we call pill pull.
well, that's what we call what?
That's what we call pill pull. It's a form of discourse and debating tactic that is of bad faith, where you pinpoint details in what the other says rather than care about the general meaning of their words.
Okay, so in the future, when you say skin color, I should assume you mean 5 other traits that you never mentioned. The issue also with skin color and at least some of the traits that you mentioned is it doesn't really make sense of the most recent findings, like, for example, Cheddar Man. Cheddar Man had dark skin, had frizzy hairs, and light eyes, and was found in England and is dated to 10,000 years ago. So, how do you make sense of some guy who's black and has frizzy hair with light eyes,
How
excuse
do you
me,
know?
living on
How do you
England?
know he had frizzy hairs and dark skin?
They took
Because
his
you've
they
read the
took his
Guardian
ancient
article?
no, they took his ancient DNA and they compared it to modern DNA of people in sub-Saharan Africa. And the
Uh-huh.
comparisons, his ancient DNA is comparable to the modern DNA of people in sub-Saharan Africa, and that correlates with those traits that were just described. It's also
All
consistent
right.
with findings from other ancient DNA extractions we got from Spain. I don't read The Guardian.
All right. So all you've discovered right now is that someone can start from Africa and take a run and reach UK and die there. This doesn't tell us anything, and the Cheddarman story has been debunked by others than me, and so I leave it to you to do that research. I don't believe that the speculations about his skin color and the illustration that was given on the Guardian are accurate. That being said, even if they were accurate, what would it change? Some guy ran from Africa and reached the UK and died 10,000 years ago. Congratulations.
Well, it just
He
shows
was
that
then,
the it just
whatever
shows that
descendants
the
he left was wiped out by white people.
well, it seems like you're just unfamiliar with the example. It just shows that using the trait or set of traits that you think are fine for identifying different races and distinguishing between populations around the world are not informative at all in light of the most recent scientific data on the topic.
The fact that there's a black guy 10,000 years ago in the UK, even if that was true, and I would be contesting the truth, but I would need to do research on that particular case to know what was the problem. But even if that was true, this is not a challenge to the conception of race and facial characteristics and the way they relate to genetics. It just tells you that someone of a race can walk from one continent to the other.
No, it significantly alters our hypotheses about how skin pigment darkened around
No,
the equator, then
the only
rapidly.
alteration you need
Um,
to The only alteration you need is
finished.
to understand that black people can walk from one place to the other.
Okay, so the thing is that it significantly adds to our understanding of human evolutionary history, something that you seem completely ignorant of, and that is
Well, those are
40,000.
nice words.
Yeah, and I'm explaining why
You make beautiful words, but you don't attribute any error to me. You're just trying to label me as ignorant, but you didn't label an error. You don't explain to me what's wrong.
One error is that the guy didn't go immediately from Africa to England. It's actually someone who was found in the Middle East rather than Africa itself. But there's a lot of other errors. I feel like just making sure you understand that the conceptual foundation for all these views and for how you talk about human genetic diversity, the one that you seem to think is perfectly fine, it's not. You need to go back to the drawing board before you can come back here and make all these proclamations about Jews or people from Japan being cucked. All of that. You don't have the right to talk about any of that until you inform yourself on what scientists actually say.
I have the right to talk about anything I want. So you can take your critique, put it up your ass, and insert it with a big baseball bat, you fucking idiot. Okay. This is the last sentence I will tell you.
Okay. So I'm going to apply to Discord. I'm going to apply to Duke
So Jeff, University. I know we have a limited time. Are you okay with continuing on, or you want to? Totally
absolutely.
Okay. Next question is going to be from, let's see, John Johnson. John Johnson, you are unmuted. John Johnson. Uh-oh. I'll ask a question. He wants to know what you think about the purity spelling on the alt-right.
Oh yeah, very annoying. I really hate it because it's a self-destructive behavior. There's no advantage in doing this. There's no advantage. One of the things that was great about the alt-right back in the Trump election days was its intellectual openness. If you leave the ground of the intellectual openness, your movement is retracting. Your movement is, rather than gaining numbers, is going to lose numbers. Because if your doors are not open to people who think differently than you, or people who are different than you, then you are bound to just be limited to whatever group you've managed to accumulate at time t. So I would say purity spiraling is a destructive behavior for the alt-right. I don't recommend it. Of course, they can do whatever they want. I don't consider myself bound to the success of the alt-right. I like them. I like interacting with them. I don't consider myself a militant for them, however. So I say, don't forget alt-right. Don't forget what led so many people toward you. It was a form of intellectual openness and a willingness to engage with the truth. When I see people on anonymous forums and in my commenting section